I began babysitting at 13 to earn extra money to spend on horribly embarrassing things like Fall Out Boy CDs. I would almost always work for my dad's clients and get referred to by word of mouth. I was babysitting for this one family who had a little girl that was 9 and a little boy that was 7. The parents seemed okay, if anything a bit odd, giving me a full schedule to follow and jokingly threatening to beat up any boy who might mysteriously show up after they left. It felt cruel for them to accuse me of even knowing a boy, given that I basically looked like an overgrown baby with frizzy hair at that age. Almost immediately after the parents leave, the little girl starts singing in a creepy high-pitched voice. "We're all alone now." "I know," said the little boy. "Let's play rape." Looking back now, I know the kid probably just heard the term on TV, knew the word was shocking, and just said it for a reaction. I totally bought into it at the time, wide-eyed and changing the subject quickly. Needless to say, these kids were hell for the next hour. I wouldn't let them watch South Park on the TV because their parents did not seem like the type to allow their precious 7 and 9-year-old to watch a show like that. As soon as I said no, the little girl said casually, "Oh, that's fine. We'll just go play PlayStation in the family room. Feel free to watch it out here." I knew exactly where that was headed. I said they could watch any other TV show in the living room while I made them dinner. The parents had left instructions for me to make them sandwiches. I could handle that. Before I had even got out the bread, I hear a massive crash. It seems like the little girl has broken a glass. A bit pissed, but ultimately with no way to punish her, I cleaned it up while these two incredibly weird kids watched with wide eyes. Dumping the broken glass in the trash, I went back to making the sandwiches. I'm a vegetarian, so while the kids had chicken, I made a simple salad one for myself. Just as I was finishing, the little boy screamed out in what, even from my hyper-village and state as an accountable teenage babysitter, sounded like a pantomime of pain. Nonetheless, I ran over to the couch in the living room to check on him. My ankle," he howled, dramatically flopping back on the couch. While I tried to figure out how he had hurt his ankle, the little girl slipped out of the room. I was aware of this, but didn't really pay it any mind, focused on this little boy pretending to be in pain. He kept saying, "I went to stand, but it hurt too much, I don't know," over and over until his eyes suddenly flicked to just behind me, where I could see the little girl standing with a smile on her face. Right then and there, he was miraculously healed. Yeah, praise the Lord. At this point, I was just thinking that these kids were really weird, craved attention a little too much, and probably needed more involvement. Whatever. I was 13 and that $60 was only 4 hours away. I set out the sandwiches for the two to eat at the dining table, went to go get a soda, and returned. After pouring the soda for both of them, I realized that they hadn't even taken a bite of their sandwiches yet. I asked them, "What are you all waiting for?" They smiled. "For you to take a bite of yours." I'm so glad I had the gut feeling to open the top part of bread of my sandwich. Because when I did, I saw glass. Broken glass. Broken glass that I had put in the trash. I stared in horror at the two little kids staring at me with menacing twin grins. I lost it, shouting, "Are you serious? At the very least, you could have injured my mouth. What the hell is wrong with you two?" Instead of crying or apologizing or pretending to be ashamed or confused, These two little psychos began laughing, not like kids. It was low and threatening. I'll never forget that noise, and my immediate reaction was, these kids are too young to be laughing like that. I called my older sister, who was 17 at the time, cried about what had happened, and she came and took over for me. While my sister was with me, the kids never really bothered us that much, which I only assumed was because she was older than me. A couple of hours later, the parents had finally come, and I spoke to them privately about the whole ordeal. Instead of them apologizing or showing their kids discipline, they started telling me that I was a bad influence to them and claimed I was lying even when I showed the glass. Of course, the kids denied any wrongdoings and didn't get punished. The parents at first were hesitant of paying me, but eventually did. From that day forward, I swore to myself that I would never babysit those two kids again. Either way, something was terribly off with that family. I just can't put my finger on it. We left the house with chills after the parents arrived, and I never babysat for those two again. They were unlike any two kids I've ever met before. For some context, I'm an 18-year-old male living in a genuinely safe town in the country. It wasn't too big, the people were nice, and everything was in walking distance. At the time, I had been living in a small one-bedroom apartment the size of a prison cell. It's only large enough to fit a bed, a stove, and a small bathroom. Anything else would have been crammed. Since the start of the pandemic, I've been laid off from my job, which resulted in me falling behind on bills. I had another job which didn't pay much, and seeing as it only got my foot through the door, I decided that I needed another one for a second source of income. As stated before, I lived in the country, so there weren't many job openings around here. We were practically isolated for the most part, and the nearest city was about 15 miles away. I ended up looking online and eventually came across some listings in need of a babysitter. I was great with kids and even had worked with some when I was doing community service in high school. Needless to say, I had met with the parents and they both seemed nice, if anything, a bit weird. I've babysat before and had dealt with many different and weird kids, but this one takes the prize. Matthew, the child I would be taking care of, was 10, which some might argue is more than old enough to be home alone, but maybe not overnight. His parents had mentioned that he was diagnosed with a form of autism, which he may be sensitive to certain topics or activities. They would be going out that night for their 20th anniversary and wouldn't be back till much later. They gave me a few basic rules to follow, which seemed simple enough, like putting him to bed at a certain time. Other than that, the process seemed easy. I'd say right off the bat, Matthew started to act a bit strange and didn't really want to do anything with me. Being the cousin of somebody autistic, I knew how they could get when interfering with them too often, so I let Matthew do his own thing. Throughout most of the night, I stayed downstairs and watched some TV while I let Matthew play in his room. Fast forward to around 10 o'clock. I tell Matthew that it's time to go to bed and he gets in no problem. This was weird considering I thought he would give me attitude about it, but I was glad he didn't. A few hours go by and there I am on my phone with my girlfriend when I hear what sounds like Matthew talking to someone, not play talking. The walls in this house were thick, so I couldn't hear as to what exactly was being said, but I knew I heard voices. I go upstairs into his room and was surprised to see him staring at his closet, making small hand gestures to himself. At first I thought it was sign language, but he then told me he was copying his friend. Rolling my eyes in annoyance, I tell him to go back to bed and that it was late. He thankfully obeys and goes back to bed. As I'm walking down the stairs, I hear noises coming from his room. I got pissed and stormed into his room, annoyed as hell. However, he was fast asleep. Through my peripheral vision, I could see his closet door slightly open with the light on, and I go to close it when I thought I could see something through the cracks. As I got a better look, I began to realize that it was an eye. I fell back in horror and yanked the closet door open, only to see that there was nobody there. Throughout the rest of the night, I stayed downstairs, texting my girlfriend about what I had just seen. She then goes on to lecture me about how I wasn't getting enough sleep and that it was all just my imagination. However, I was certain it was not.
My first babysitting gig, and the worst fear I've ever felt. I grew up in a really safe city in the Midwest, in an even safer neighborhood sort of set back in the woods and separated from the main part of town. I haven't had a lot of creepy encounters in my short life, knock on wood, so this is pretty much the most afraid I've ever been. I was 11 at the time, and had just passed a CPR babysitting essentials course at the rec. My neighborhood was very close-knit. All of the kids in my street played together, and because of my two younger brothers, I would soon become the automatic babysitter for the 3 families we lived closest to. I'd looked after my brothers for short amounts of time, but this was my first job as a real babysitter, watching the 2 grade school-age children who lived across the street. They were family friends. The parents had promised they'd be home by 11 p.m., and I knew that my parents were home and ready to step in if I needed anything. So I was a little nervous, but felt like I had things under control. The kids were a nervous babysitter's dream. They'd been trained that they were only allowed to choose 1 treat each before bed, and actually refused my offer to let them finish the show we were watching, because it was their bedtime, and they still needed to brush their teeth first. I was floored, but it made my job super easy. So I tucked them in and headed back downstairs to watch TV until their parents returned home. The mom is an interior designer, so the house is spacious and absolutely beautiful. Their living room is at the back of the house, with floor-to-ceiling windows and great views of the woods in their backyard. The couch is set up with its back to those windows, and I was watching TV with their elderly white lab, Alex. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something large and light-colored brush past the window behind me. I thought it might just be a deer, but I was 11 and alone, and I have an active imagination, so I began to feel uneasy and pretty on edge. The parents weren't due back for another 2 hours, so I walked into the kitchen to call my mom and dad for reassurance. Alex followed. Their kitchen faces the living room, with the house phone on the counter. This was before cell phones happened. Standing at the counter dialing my parents, I had a clear view through the broad archway into the living room, and out those enormous windows into the backyard. Alex lay down at my feet as I stood next to the counter, and told my mom that I thought I'd seen something at the window. Hearing her voice was as comforting and reassuring as I thought it would be. So I told her that, no, I didn't need Dad to come over, and that yes, I'd call her if I needed anything at all. I then hung up the phone and sat down on the floor to rub Alex's ears and belly for a few minutes. Still kind of wary of the living room though. I hadn't been there for too long before I caught a glimpse of something odd outside those giant windows. I looked harder, past the glare of the TV. I noticed a tiny light bobbing around in the woods. Probably just a neighbor, I thought. But as I watched, the light seemed to be moving in what was undeniably my direction. My whole body froze, and I stared as the light got closer and closer to the living room windows. And at some point I realized, with complete and paralyzing horror, that the light had grown large enough that the sword had to be right outside of the house. The beam swung from one side of the living room to the other, and then settled directly on my face. I don't even think I squinted in the bright light, as it shone through the window into my eyes. I was too startled. Alex snoozed on, placid in his old age and entirely unaware that my heart had pretty much stopped beating. The light moved again, this time swinging away to illuminate a face from underneath. I saw dark, hollow eye sockets and the glowing curves of someone's cheeks, but the face's details were lost in the harsh angle of the flashlight's beam. At this point, I was trying with all my might to scream or to move my fingers enough to dial 911, or to move out of view of the window. Literally anything would have been better than sitting there with my mouth open and tears in my eyes like a stuffed turkey. But I'd never felt this kind of icy terror before and was completely immobilized by it. Everything felt like it was moving in slow motion, and I was totally powerless. The light swung around me to point at me, then quickly moved back underneath the horrible face outside. It repeated this pattern once or twice, then it suddenly disappeared. The flashlight had been turned off, and for whatever reason, that was enough to finally let me move again. I quickly stood up and hit dial, about to call 911, as I mentally debated whether to hole up in the master bedroom with the children, or just grab them and try to run out the front door to my parents' house. The red class had not prepared me for this. Before I even got as far as the foyer and the first one though, I then heard a loud boom and felt my gut leap into my throat as I realized that I'd remembered closing the main garage doors and locked the door from the garage to the laundry room, but I couldn't remember locking the main door from the garage to their backyard. I almost dropped the phone as someone began pounding on the interior door. Through the pounding though, I could hear a voice. A really fucking familiar voice. Mav 49, it's Dad, let me in. I stumbled over, completely numb, and unlocked the door. My dad could hardly stand up. He was laughing so hard. Apparently my mom had sent him over anyway to check on me, and to make sure there was nothing to be afraid of. He'd done a quick sweep of the woods and backyard with a flashlight, under the assumption that Mom had mentioned he'd be coming over. He saw me through their window and attempted to show me it was him by pointing at me, and then shining the light on his face. Under his frickin' face. He was unaware that the shadows made it impossible to tell who he was, until we saw the color drain from my face and realized he'd just given me the scare of my life. He thought it was pretty funny. I didn't really agree. I know that the ending kind of makes the story inappropriate for Let's Not Meet, but up until I heard my dad's voice, I really thought that I was about to get all kinds of murdered.